All right, guys, this is the sticky notes for today. This is chapter 3, module 6, starting on page 73. So, we're going to be talking about the movement of energy, which is food chains, food webs, energy pyramids, and trophic levels. Okay. So, the learning goals are basically be able to explain what an ecosystem is, the differences between photosynthesis and respiration, um, the how to use the trophic levels as a way to analyze food chains and food webs. We want to talk about this thing called ecosystem productivity, which is a quantitative way of looking at energy flow. And finally, model how energy is transferred and that efficiency in a trophic pyramid. Okay. So the first term that we want to really think about is the capture of energy from the sun, and then how organisms then use that energy to burn food to release energy. So the first concept is known as producers, also known as autotrophs. So these are going to be one thing about the kind of organism that are producers, and then what is the chemical process that they use to process solar energy. Okay. The next terms are cellular respiration. Okay, so what organisms use that to release energy on the next page. And finally, we really want to look at figure 7.6. So we want to know what are the reactants and products of both photosynthesis and cellular respiration. Okay. So when we look at this diagram, right, notice that there is a connection between these two, right? So think about, compare the reactants of one with the products of the other. Okay, and so you should find that connection. How are these two processes interrelated? On the next page, we have concepts of the food chain. So we have primary consumers, which are known as herbivores, so things that eat plants, and then secondary and tertiary consumers. Okay, so what determines what a secondary consumer is? What determines what a tertiary consumer is? And then what kind of animals are good examples of those things? Okay, so a way to model that at the simplest level that you learned in ninth grade is in figure 6.5, which are food chains. Okay? So the key thing to think about in a food chain is the direction that the arrow is pointing from and what is it pointing to. So in this case, the arrow points from the grass to the zebra. Okay, so that's a confusing point for some students because they always point the arrow in the wrong direction. The way to think about it is what eats what, right? So zebras eat grass, so the grass goes into the zebra. Zebras are eaten by lions, so they go into the lion. Okay, so think about the direction of the arrow is very, very important. Okay, so related to each of these levels is their trophic level. Okay, so producers, mostly plants. Things that eat producers are primary consumers. Things that eat primary consumers are secondary consumers, and things that eat secondary consumers are tertiary consumers. Okay, so 1, 2, and 3. The next thing we want to think about are food webs, which is the definition is here, and the food web is 6.6. Okay, so when you're looking at a food web, it is a bunch of food chains interconnected. And so now what I want you to think about is, so now you have things that are both eating the zebras and things that the zebra's eating. And so things can be multiple levels. So look at the organism based on the key, right? So these are the trophic levels, the role in the food web, and that organisms can be on different levels even though depending on what they're eating. Okay, so notice the lion, the hyena are on multiple trophic levels depending on what they're eating. Okay, so know that what would make the hyena a primary consumer, what makes the hyena a secondary consumer, and what makes the hyena also a scavenger. Okay, so what is it eating to make it each of those three levels? The other thing to think about when you're looking at a food web is if I've removed an organism from the food web, what would happen to all the things that rely on it on food? And then what would happen to all the things that it is eating as its own food? Okay, so if I got rid of lions, what would happen to all the animals that it eats? Quick note, you have three different kinds of organisms that consume dead or decayed animals, known as detritivores, scavengers, and decomposers. And all those organisms are slightly different, but they all eat dead or decaying things. Okay? All right. So now we're on to the last two topics, which is productivity and trophic levels. So this is getting a little bit into the math. And so if you've done a little bit of like economics, you can think about how these things are related. So we want to compare the productivity or how much energy is being harnessed by these ecosystems. And the first number is known as gross primary productivity. Okay, so think of this as your gross income, or how much money do you make in a year. The second thing to think about is net primary productivity. So what is that? Write down the definition and how do you calculate it? The way to think about it is like your net income. So if you make a certain amount per year, but you spend a certain amount, what's left over, how much you can save, that is the net income. So in this case, that's your net productivity is equal to gross primary productivity minus respiration. The equation's right here. Please make sure you write that down. We're going to practice how to make those calculations on Wednesday. Okay. Figure 6.7, 6.8 are nice ways of representing that. So think about what the vast majority of happens to the solar energy. Only 1% makes it to GPP. And then when you have gross primary productivity, it gets transferred into two different directions. So what are they? And that's answered by that figure. Figure 6.8 is going to basically compare the different biomes that we learned about 2 weeks ago and puts them in how productive they are at the net primary productivity level. Okay, so the way to think about that is what are the three factors that allow something to have very, very high or very, very low net productivity? And these are the three factors. Okay, so what do you want these three factors to be to have the highest amount of net primary productivity? The last part is thinking about energy efficiency. So as you move up the food chain, a lot of energy is lost between levels. And you want to think about why is the energy being lost and how much. Okay, so what percentage is being lost between the levels? So, calculate that percentage. Okay. And then something new for this week is I'm going to put these 6 questions on your sticky notes. All right, hope this was helpful. Please like and subscribe.